The next chapter in the Ferguson case is the Justice Department's inquiry, which is actually two separate investigations. In the first, federal investigators are looking into whether Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson used unreasonable force when he shot and killed Michael Brown on August 9th. In the second, the feds are trying to determine whether officers with the Ferguson Police Department routinely engage in unlawful and discriminatory practices. But with Attorney General Eric Holder admitting this week that federal law imposes a higher legal standard, what outcome can we expect from the department's findings? Let's bring in our legal panel. Today we have Fred Tesey, who's a former federal prosecutor, and Diana Eisman, who's a criminal defense attorney. Fred, let's start with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Let's start with you, Fred. You know, this criminal case that could be brought against Officer Wilson, federal case, you know, what are they really up against in trying to prove this?
Well, in order to get charges, they have to show that he acted with open disregard or rotten disregard of Michael Brown's constitutional rights. It's a very, very difficult standard, as Eric Holder has admitted on a couple of occasions. Although this is the same Justice Department that recently released a memo telling the president that despite the fact that 26 times he said he can't grant amnesty for immigration, he can. So if they follow the law, the charges against Officer Wilson will not go forward against him personally.
So, Diana, let's go over to you. How do you see prosecutors going about trying to do this?
I actually agree with Fred. I think that it's going to be very difficult to make any kind of a case against Darren Wilson under these circumstances. I think the facts were pretty clear that when he initially approached Mr. Brown, he told him to get out of the road, and there was a struggle that ensued. And I think that the altercation that existed between those two parties resulted in that shooting, and he was an aggressor. Brown was an aggressor, and it's going to be very difficult with such a high standard to prove that Wilson violated his constitutional rights.
Fred, a lot of testimony before this grand jury, including from Officer Wilson himself. He's also given television interviews. How will this play in?
It shouldn't play in at all. I mean, Officer Wilson's statements could be used against him by a federal grand jury considering the case, but I mean, it really shouldn't. I mean, part of what you're seeing here, Leah, is that people who want Officer Wilson to be charged and convicted are going to look at this process and pick out the stuff that supports their position, and other people are going to not. And that's why our burden of proof in these situations is not by 100%. There's going to be things that go one way or the other, but in the long run, and I think at the end of the day, charges against this police officer personally would be flat out travesty of justice.
Okay, Diane, let's move on to the other investigation. Feds are looking into the Ferguson Police Department, whether or not there was bias there. You know, the Department of Justice has looked into at least 20 different police departments across the country. What's your take on this, and what can we expect?
I think it's a great idea for them to look into the police department. If there statistically has been issues involving injustice and you know, racial relations that are obviously very strained between the citizens of Ferguson and the police force, I don't think it's inappropriate at all for the federal government to come in and just make sure that the police agency that is tasked with keeping these citizens safe is doing their job. Los Angeles Police Department was under a federal consent decree until 2013.
And Fred, real quickly, just over to you for one last question. Does Michael Brown's family, do you expect them to file a lawsuit?
I fully expect them to do. It's a wrongful death case. The burden is by a preponderance of the evidence, a much lower burden than any of these criminal cases. But given the grand jury's findings and the facts of the case, I think that would be a very, very difficult civil suit for them to prevail on.
Okay, Fred Tesey and Diana Eisman, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks for having me.